Indigenous peoples are rooted in their land. It's where they are born. We're not talking about states or borders, about wanting to move somewhere else. The land that has always been ours is the Kola Peninsula. No one can take that away from us. You can't pull it out of us. Our relatives are there. Our ancestry is there. I've traced my family tree back to 1670. All my ancestors lived on the Kola Peninsula, all of them. This is a very important topic for me. I'm very proud and very happy that I was born on the Kola Peninsula, and I will do everything I can to protect it.
In my view, putting indigenous organizations, activists, and other groups on Russian lists, the lists of extremists, terrorists, foreign agents, so-called undesirable organizations, that was intimidation. But what happened on the 17th of December when Daria Yegoreva was arrested, when they came to activists' homes across the country all at once, that wasn't just intimidation anymore. That was the law in action. They want to show how this law works, how they use it. It was a very public attack on indigenous peoples.
The struggle of indigenous peoples is about right to their culture, the right to their land, the right to their territory, the right to self-determination. And when we speak about companies that support indigenous peoples, what we are really talking about is charity. And charity is not a right, it is something else entirely. Indigenous peoples do not need handouts. Indigenous peoples need rights.
Hello everyone, you're listening to the Anti-Discrimination Centre Memorial podcast on the rights of indigenous peoples. This is our 5th episode, and today we are talking about international advocacy for rights. We'll be discussing the tools and mechanisms that have been created specifically for indigenous peoples, and of course the risks that defenders of indigenous peoples' rights face today because of their work. If this topic matters to you, please like and subscribe to the podcast. And now I would like to introduce our guests. Today we are joined by Valentina Sovkina, a representative of the Sámi people and a member of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Hello, Valentina.
Hello.
Yana Tanagasheva, a representative of the Shore people and an activist with the International Committee of Indigenous Peoples of Russia.
Good evening.
Nikita Bulanin, a member of the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs and coordinator of the Land Rights Program within the organization. Nikita, welcome.
Hello, everybody.
And Olga Abramenko, an expert at the Anti-Discrimination Memorial Center. Good afternoon, Olga.
Hello.
Today's reality in Russia compels us to begin with some very recent and very troubling events, repression and persecution. And of course, the most serious case is that of Daria Yegoreva, who is currently being held in the pretrial detention. She has been accused of involvement in a so-called terrorist extremist organization. She could face up to 20 years in prison. My first question is for Valentina, who herself was subjected to persecution very recently. How is this persecution connected to your cooperation with the UN?
In fact, there is a pattern when representatives of indigenous peoples turn to international organizations, especially at the UN or in discussions on climate or biodiversity, and speak about the problems affecting their territories. This is effectively treated as an act of disobedience. Very often, attempts are made to force us back within the framework of the law, of the constitution, and so on. But we understand that even in Russia today, the provisions concerning the rights of indigenous peoples are not always implemented. Take Article 69, which states that the rights of indigenous peoples are guaranteed. In reality, however, we see the opposite happening on the ground. So when we turn to international platforms, our voice becomes visible. We are heard. And perhaps that is not always welcomed by those who seek to control us. Any activity that cannot be controlled is treated very harshly. So what happened on the 17th was, in fact, an act of intimidation directed at Indigenous peoples, a way of showing that nothing goes unnoticed. Although they keep telling us to go on, complain to whoever you like, we don't care. But clearly they do care. That's why this action took place. It is definitely intimidation and control, because when a person becomes independent, when they start looking for solutions, that raises a lot of questions. First of all, who are Indigenous peoples? They are the people who live on their land, who have preserved it, protected it, and cared for it for many years. And now these territories are effectively being taken away or used for state needs. And of course, when there is no consent, when people do not want to give up their land, that is not welcomed. When we speak about the international principle of free, prior, and informed consent, it causes a real storm. We are always told, but we are negotiating with you, we are ready to share with you. But what exactly are we sharing? We are losing our land entirely. And when land is lost, people lose their identity. That is where we are now. If you look at Indigenous peoples around the world, wherever expansion is taking place, it becomes clear that people are effectively being stripped of their roots, their language, their traditions, and their culture. We become people who no longer remember where we come from, and such people are much easier to control.
Do you feel that this control and intimidation are increasing?
Of course, they are increasing. I remember when we raised the issue of creating an elected body, our own independent representative body of the Sámi people, we were immediately labeled as separatists, as if we wanted to break away from the state, even though the Constitution contains an article stating that a people has the right to self-determination without seceding from the state. Nevertheless, a second body was created, the one subordinate to the government of the Murmansk region, and it remains subordinate to this day. As a result, our independence was gradually eroded. It was simply suppressed.
Yana, you've already had a direct confrontation with an official representative of the Russian Federation in Geneva.
I would even say it's not so much intensifying as being put into practice. The Russian authorities are now actively implementing this repressive legislation, and the repressive methods themselves are becoming harsher. In July 2022, I took part in a session of the expert mechanism and delivered a statement. During my speech, a representative of the Russian authorities from the Moscow mission approached me. After I had finished speaking, he began questioning me aggressively, trying to pressure me into giving him my contact details and asking for my business card. Then he asked whether I had been to Ukraine. My statement was based on documented violations of the rights of the shore people, as well as violations affecting other indigenous peoples of the North, Siberia, and the Far East. I also spoke about the terrible war that had begun in Ukraine, the full-scale invasion. My speech clearly acted as a trigger for this representative. So these kinds of actions, perhaps not even outright intimidation, although in a way they are, amount to a form of verbal harassment. And this happened during an open session, during public statements. It even happens at UN sessions. All of this, of course, began a long time ago. In my view, putting indigenous organizations, activists, and other groups on Russian lists, the lists of extremists, terrorists, foreign agents, so-called undesirable organizations, that was intimidation. But what happened on the 17th of December, when Daria Yegoreva was arrested, when they came to activists' homes across the country all at once, that wasn't just intimidation anymore. That was the law in action. They want to show how this law works, how they use it. It was a very public attack on indigenous peoples. And at the same time, as Valentina rightly said, indigenous peoples are not extremists or terrorists. They are simply guardians of their lands. They are defending their territories, defending their rights to their small areas of land, areas that mining companies disregard every single day. And I would like to remind you that with regard to my people and my own family, acts of intimidation, threats, persecution, even the burning of villages, all of this has happened before, not 10 or 15 years ago, but back in Soviet times.
So, on one hand, the authorities say, go ahead, complain to the UN, we don't care. On the other hand, it turns out that they do care, and repression follows. At the same time, the Russian Federation continues to build a certain image for itself on the international stage. For example, international days are celebrated. It raises the question, what is the aim? What is the international policy in this area? Valentina.
When delegations from Russia speak, they present themselves as representatives of indigenous peoples, but they are funded by the state. It is very noticeable how different their statements are from those of people who genuinely see what is happening in regions where there is profound injustice, and from those who are prepared to describe everything in our country as wonderful and successful. At the moment, there is a strong emphasis on festivals and cultural events because we are turning into a kind of caricature, something decorative that replaces real culture and real traditions. In other words, a sort of showcase is being created to display the diversity of indigenous peoples, to show how beautifully it can all be presented. But when you look at each case more closely, it becomes clear that there is a hierarchy there as well. Those who genuinely defend rights are simply harassed, sidelined, ignored, and so on. And those who at least in some way support the official line are given certain positions, and large-scale public events are organized with them. As a result, a great many people think everything is wonderful here. Everyone is singing, dancing, receiving benefits. But if you really look into it and analyze, there are a great many hidden problems.
Nikita, your experience involves working with indigenous peoples on other countries. To what extent is it possible to compare the situation when it comes to activity on the international stage?
To be honest, unfortunately, the Russian situation is becoming less and less unique. I don't think Valentina would disagree with me here. We are living through a period of regression in the field of human rights, and this regression affects not only countries with authoritarian tendencies, but also countries that have traditionally positioned themselves as global leaders in human rights. As you mentioned, we work in virtually every region of the world. We have partner organizations among indigenous peoples groups, and unfortunately I am aware of at least 4 cases outside Russia where indigenous human rights defenders have been punished for speaking out at the international level. There was a case involving one of my colleagues, a member of the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples from Nicaragua, from the Miskito people. She was simply barred from returning home. She took part in a session of the expert mechanism in Geneva, went to the airport, tried to check in for her flight home, where her children and husband were waiting for her, and was unable to board. Nicaragua prevented her from returning. As far as I know, but for some time she remained in Geneva in a kind of legal limbo. We have a colleague from an African country who, every time he speaks at the UN, has to spend some time in a third country before returning home, waiting for the situation to settle down. There is also a representative from a South Asian country. She was abducted on her way to the UN in an attempt to prevent her from attending the meeting. In some ways, her case resembles what happened to Valentina 10 years ago. There was a whole struggle to prevent her actual imprisonment. So yes, authorities sometimes say, speak, go ahead, it makes no difference to us. But when people genuinely try to speak, they are willing to go to extreme lengths to stop them from speaking at high-level forums. I would also like to say something about this so-called festivalization. Unfortunately, this is not a uniquely Russian phenomenon. It is becoming more and more common around the world, even in countries that consider themselves democratic, because it is far easier to talk about a decorative folkloric image than to talk about rights. But the struggle of indigenous peoples is about right to their culture, the right to their land, the right to their territory, the right to self-determination. And when we speak about companies that support indigenous peoples, what we are really talking about is charity. Then charity is not a right, it is something else entirely. Indigenous peoples do not need handouts. Indigenous peoples need rights.
I would like to return to the question of rights themselves and the protection of those rights. There are, after all, special mechanisms within the UN system for this. Olga, what are these mechanisms? How do they function and how can they be used?
Yes, I've been listening to my colleagues, and I myself have often been to the UN, especially on issues relating to the rights of indigenous peoples. In fact, this became a permanent area of ADC Memorial after we met defenders of the rights of the shore people, in particular Yana Tanagasheva. Together with shore human rights defenders and later with the International Committee on Indigenous Peoples of Russia, after many activists were forced into exile, we submitted various reports to the UN, not only to the specialized bodies dealing directly with indigenous peoples, but also to other committees, such as the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination or the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. We also submitted information to the UN Special Rapporteurs. And sadly, one of the repeated themes of our reports has been and remains the repression faced by defenders of indigenous peoples' rights because of their work. What is particularly outrageous is that they are being persecuted just for informing the very UN bodies that were created specially to protect indigenous peoples. It is no coincidence that such special bodies were created within the UN system. Indigenous peoples are, as a rule, very poorly represented in their own countries and are often unable to participate fully in decision-making process on issues that directly affect them. And these bodies, which were established, one could say, almost before our eyes, are actually very recent developments. The Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues was established in 2000. The Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was created in 2007. The key international instruments related to indigenous rights were also adopted, historically speaking, as if yesterday. Besides, climate issues are really important for indigenous peoples, and after participation in these international forums and bodies set up specially for them, the indigenous activists end up being persecuted, which of course completely goes against the idea that these mechanisms are meant for.
Am I right in thinking that the time and energy that should be spent protecting the rights, like land and culture and so on, is instead used to fight off repression? In other words, it takes away from what these forums are really meant to do.
Yes, there is a contradiction here. All of this was created for indigenous peoples, and yet they are being repressed for the very same thing. And indeed, over the years that ADC Memorial has been working on the issue of indigenous peoples, including the UN bodies, we have seen this trend, which our colleagues have already mentioned, that independent activists are being prevented from participating in international bodies, so they cannot speak out and express their opinion.
Instead, loyal activists who are funded by the state are promoted. We know that extractive companies also fund trips for indigenous activists from Russia who are loyal to the authorities. They push a pro-Russian agenda in international bodies. And unfortunately, experts say that countries in the global south, where indigenous peoples are more numerous, are also using this tactic.
I have a question for Valentina and Yana. You still have to work at the international level. It's your life, it's your work. What steps do you think are possible here?
First of all, it's rightly said that the forum was set up for indigenous peoples. There's a tendency these days to silence their voices because our meetings very often include not just indigenous peoples, but also states and institutions. And it occurred to me, maybe it's time to turn the permanent forum into a space specifically for indigenous peoples, a place where we can gather around the table and reach agreement among ourselves. The Sámi had a tradition. When they met to decide a question, they could argue, almost to the point of fighting. Then they'd be locked up, for example, in a bathhouse or some kind of traditional dwelling until they reached an agreement. Only then would they come out and deliver their verdict. In other words, we need a space where we, the indigenous peoples, can come to an agreement among ourselves without someone leading us or showing us how to talk. Because nowadays you often hear, don't raise this issue, give everyone a chance to speak. But wait, we are the experts on the issues of the peoples who elected us where we were born. So I think strengthening the voice of indigenous peoples depends on us ourselves. After all that's happened, I don't think it's possible to stay silent. Everything that's going on must be brought into the open, discussed, and specific decisions made. The declaration was adopted for a reason. If you reread the document, it's basically a handbook that just needs to be put into practice. Yes.
Yana, what about you?
We really need to amplify the voices of indigenous peoples, especially Russian indigenous peoples. It's really important today to push back against Russian propaganda at the international level. That propaganda tries to paint a beautiful picture of a wonderful life, but behind that picture lie the grief and tears of all the peoples of the Russian Federation. It's crucial to keep informing UN mechanisms about human rights violations. Yes, it's incredibly difficult right now. Getting information is really hard. People are afraid. We see what repressive methods are being used. But there are still mechanisms that accept information, various organizations, and we have to keep using them even in these circumstances. Those of us who have left the country are trying to speak out as loudly as possible to inform as many mechanisms as we can. Thanks to the support of international organizations, our International Committee of Indigenous Peoples of Russia also submits alternative report to special procedures and participates in UN mechanisms. People sometimes ask, why bother with the UN if there might be no response? Maybe it's all pointless. We must keep going. We have to continue this human rights work. First, to document violations. Second, to show solidarity with other indigenous peoples around the world. The history of international human rights protection for indigenous peoples isn't that long, but our ancestors fought for this. This work must be supported and developed. New mechanisms and new documents to protect rights need to be created.
I also want to say about solidarity. Right now, with the persecution of defenders of indigenous rights in Russia, we see that a significant number of organizations have spoken out in support of Daria Yegereva, who is in detention, and those who were persecuted in December 2025 in Russia. In terms of solidarity, the UN is a very important mechanism. I'd also like to mention another very recent risk. I mean the fact that the United States, on President Trump's initiative, probably started cutting fundings for many international programs and reducing U.S. participation in international organizations. While some other vulnerable groups might find alternative funding or alternative opportunities for international advocacy, many indigenous peoples have no adequate representation anywhere except at the UN. On our side, we are also pushing the issue of indigenous rights in other forums. For example, we held events and meetings within the European Parliament, at the EU level. Jana is right, of course. We also need to look for some new platforms.
I have a question for Nikita. You started by saying that we're living in an era of regression in human rights and in advocacy in general. Based on your international experience, do you think we need to create new platforms?
We're living in a situation where the world is changing and we don't really know exactly which way it's going. For now, though, the future doesn't look very promising to me personally. I don't believe we should forget about the UN as a structure that has lost its importance. I actually think the opposite. Everyone who cares about human rights, who believes in human rights, especially the rights of indigenous peoples, we all need to stand united behind the UN. Yes, it's a relatively new structure, but decades of struggle lie behind it, decades of advocacy at the government level. Indigenous leaders have worked to build a system where they can speak on equal terms with state representatives. Building a new system could take many decades. In the current circumstances, we must protect what we already have. I cannot tell indigenous peoples what to do. They speak for themselves. I don't have that mandate. But I can say that we, as people who believe in human rights, need to unite. We need to see each other as allies. Even if we disagree on some issues, we need to focus on the common goal, and that should bring us together. Yes, the UN is not a perfect system. It doesn't give quick results. But right now, the UN is the only system where not only states talk to each other, but representatives of indigenous peoples can speak for their own peoples. There's no other system like this in the world. It's worth protecting.
I listen to all the participants and I often hear the word unite. And I understand that it's really important for indigenous peoples to unite. But I see two different situations. On the one hand, there are peoples living in different neighboring states. On the other, there are peoples living within the borders of a single large state. And this raises suspicions from the states about separatism, and the repressions follow. How does advocacy differ in these two cases at the international level?
In the case of the Sámi people, there is a certain institutional representation. I mean the Sámi parliament.
Our total population is less than 100,000. On the Kola Peninsula, there are about 1,500 of us. In fact, we're almost invisible, and maybe we really do cause great concern for the state because there are so few of us. And there are 3 other states nearby where our compatriots live, and they probably think, what if they unite? That's why they watch us closely, to make sure, God forbid, we don't say anything. But we say again, indigenous peoples are attached to the territories where they were born. We're not talking about wanting to break away from the state. The territory that has always been ours is the Kola Peninsula. Our relatives are there, our family trees are there. My family tree can be traced back to the 17th century. All my ancestors lived on the Kola Peninsula, all of them. This is a very important issue for me, and I will do everything I can to protect it. Of course, this topic touches on geopolitics. Yes, the Sámi are a transnational people. Some might think, what if they unite? Maybe I'm saying seditious things, but that's normal. Everyone is attached to the land where they were born.
Jana, what do you think? What about you?
I remembered something that happened to me at the same session of the expert mechanism. The same Russian delegate approached a Sámi representative from Sweden. She had been talking about violations of Sámi rights in Sweden, about mining companies coming onto their lands. After her speech, the Russian delegate gave her his business card and said, "Contact me." Very powerful speech. Then he spoke himself, saying in Sweden, Norway, the United States and other countries, these peoples had been colonized and had a terrible history, but we never did that. Our peoples have always lived happily. We never colonized them. Everything's fine with them. That's how the Russian delegation speaks at the international level. They don't mention that they colonized our peoples in Siberia. They don't mention that the Sámi of the Kola Peninsula live in difficult conditions, that mining companies come onto their lands. They just don't talk about it.
Nikita, do you have any examples where advocacy had helped indigenous peoples?
There's a people in Kenya called the Ogiek. They live in the Mau forest right in the center of Kenya, on a continent where most governments generally reject the very idea of indigenous peoples. Through their own efforts and advocacy, the Ogiek achieve recognition at all levels of African regional organizations. The African Court on Human and People's Rights also recognized their rights and ordered the Kenyan government to pay compensation to indigenous peoples. Moreover, the Kenyan government has de facto admitted it was wrong. They recognize that the Ogiek have lived in this forest on their traditional lands for generations, starting in colonial times, continuing in post-colonial times, and still today. That's the good part of the story. The bad part is that the court's decision hasn't yet been fully implemented. In any case, advocacy at the decision-making level is working, but there's still a little left to do in terms of enforcing the decisions. So there's hope. The real heroes here are the Ogiek themselves. They refuse to stay silent about violations of their rights. They mobilize their representatives, organize demonstrations in Nairobi, talk to politicians at the national level, and speak extensively at the UN and in African regional human rights bodies.
I'd like to say that, in general, the very adoption of specific legislation on indigenous peoples in Russia could be possible thanks to the international contacts between indigenous peoples in recent years, especially since the 2000s. This is something that simply couldn't have happened in the Soviet Union. This movement is international, and it has a crucial role that contributes to positive change at the national level. Of course, we all very much hope that we'll be able to protect our colleagues who are currently in detention, who are being persecuted in Russia and repressed for their advocacy work and for speaking out at the UN and other international bodies.
Our time is up. I'd like to thank all of you for taking part in this interesting and important conversation. I'd also like to thank our listeners. Please don't forget, like and subscribe. The next episode of the podcast will cover a very difficult topic, demilitarization, and the impact of the war of Russian Federation in Ukraine, its effect on the indigenous peoples, their situation, and the realization of their rights. In the meantime, I wish you all the best, and I hope to see you again soon. You've been listening to the podcast of the Anti-Discrimination Centre Memorial, Brussels.